But so you can ask Jacob a little more about that later. So Jacob wrote on a topic that is a little bit less explicitly Jewish, but after learning a little bit about totalitarianism in our unit on evil and the Holocaust, Jacob decided to really pursue a senior thesis focusing on totalitarianism, and his paper focused on identifying the elements of totalitarian regimes. And so Jacob's going to present now on totalitarianism. Thanks.
At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leaped to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, the stormy applause, rising to an ovation, continued. The director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the Presidium. Aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation, he still kept on applauding. 9 minutes, 10. In anguish, he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter dared not stop. Insanity, to the last man. With make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope, the district leaders were just going to go on and on applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. And even then, those who left would not falter. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a businesslike expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off his revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were, and that was how they went about eliminating them. That same night, the factory director was arrested. They usually pasted 10 years on him on the pretext of something quite different. But after he had signed Form 206, the final document of the interrogation, his interrogator reminded him, "Don't ever be the first to stop applauding." That was from The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is a history of the Soviet legal system. And he collected these stories from people who had witnessed them and collected them into this book, which he published as in underground literature called Samizdat. And it was one of the important pieces of resistance to the Soviet government that eventually toppled it. But my thesis is on the question of, how does a scene like this happen? How could we get to a place where an entire nation becomes gripped by the kind of insanity that characterized Stalinist Russia? In my senior thesis, I explored this question from the perspective of utopianism, arguing that utopian political ideologies lead to state-sponsored violence. I did this through the lens of two countries, the Soviet Union and North Korea. My central argument proposes that governments motivated by the pursuit of a perfect society will demonstrate hostility towards perceived impediments to the development of that perfect society and impose collective guilt due to the state's distorted perspective. These will result in the establishment of systems of violence. In the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution left the country with a number of institutions to reinvent, the legal system chiefly among them. As the vanguard party of the revolution, these former rebels found themselves in charge of the apparatus of government and were tasked by the utopian political ideology to use them to bring about Marx's paradisal communist society in which all labor would be voluntary and there would be no more economic class. As the dictatorship of the proletariat being the working class, they believed that one of the only legitimate uses of the government's power was to prevent the bourgeoisie, who, according to Marx's theory, were the people who owned the businesses which employed the proletariat and oppressed them, from retaking control over the government. If they were allowed to do so, the country could not progress into communism. This sounds great in theory, right? In practice, it was horrific. In order to do this, the new government set up tribunals to hear criminal cases against these kinds of people. These were also described in that same book, The Gulag Archipelago. And so we heard from Comrade Nikolai Krylenko, the head prosecutor of the Soviet Union, that a tribunal was not that kind of court. On another occasion, we would hear from him that a tribunal was not a court at all. A tribunal is an organ of the class struggle of the workers, directed against their enemies, and must act from the point of view of the interests of the revolution, having in mind the most desirable results of the masses of workers and peasants. People are not people, but carriers of specific ideas. No matter what the individual qualities of the defendant, only one method of evaluating him is to be applied, evaluation from the point of view of class expediency. What Krylenko means by class expediency is exactly what I was just describing, the bourgeoisie being suppressed so that they could no longer take over the government. Millions of people were sent to work camps, and many of them to their deaths by this line of thinking. By extension, this philosophy found its way into the legal system of North Korea, a country which has practiced exactly this kind of violence up until the current day. And I don't know how much you know about the legal system of North Korea, but it runs along exactly the same lines that were in place in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. They currently have a system of political labor camps that runs exactly the same way and currently imprison somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. According to one of my sources for this paper, Portrait of North Korean Life, written by Barbara Demick, in the past, Koreans were bound by a caste system nearly as rigid as that of India. Noblemen wore white shirts and high black horsehair hats, while slaves wore wooden tags around their necks. The old class structure drew heavily on the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, who believed that humans fit neatly into a social pyramid. Kim Il-sung took the least humane elements of Confucianism and combined them with Stalinism. At the top of the pyramid, instead of an emperor, resided Kim Il-sung and his family. From there began a downward progression of 51 categories that were lumped into three broad classes: the core class, the wavering class, and the hostile class. This hostile class was another iteration of Krylenko's pronouncement that a Marxist government should conduct its legal business from the point of view of class expediency. That was an idea that found its way into all of the societies that were under the Soviet sphere of influence, and it's almost impossible to overstate how incredible an idea and how influential it was on those countries, because we're talking about a legal system that considered the idea of guilt itself to no longer be relevant. They considered you to be worthy of imprisonment if you were standing in the way of the development of Utopian. So a trial would focus not on what you had done, but on the sort of danger you could propose to the government. In North Korea, this system, like Demick was talking about, was combined with Confucianism, which believed in inherited guilt. So men and women can pass down their guilt to their children, and up until recently, they instituted a system where 3 generations of a family could be punished for the crime of a single person. I knew a lot about the North Korean system before I started this paper, but I didn't know about the Confucius element or influence on it, which was interesting to me because it's not the sort of thing that you'd think would mesh very well with a communist system, but it did, and it still forms the basis of the North Korean government. But perhaps the most horrific example of this thinking and practice took place in the 1930s in the Soviet Ukraine, which experienced a terrible famine which took some 6 million lives. The tragedy was a result of the policies of the Stalinist government and its efforts to collectivize the agricultural system of the country. Many Ukrainians resisted the government, refusing to hand over their grain, and the subsequent Soviet retaliation, such as raising production quotas to unachievable levels, essentially ensured that starvation would take place. By withholding their grain, the government considered them class enemies, part of the bourgeoisie, and therefore standing in the way of the development of communism, and decided to starve them as punishment for what they were doing. In his book on the terrors visited on Eastern Europe during World War II by the Soviets and Nazis, Timothy Snyder discusses the Ukrainian famine, the Stalinist policies that created it, and the Soviets' political philosophy and those involved in the resistance to their aims. The Bolsheviks presented history as a struggle of classes, the poor are making revolutions against the richer to move history forward. Thus, officially, the plan to annihilate the kulaks, a Soviet classification for so-called rich peasants and also class enemies of the government, was not a simple decision of a rising tyrant and his local retinue. It was a historical necessity, a gift from the hand of a stern but benevolent Clio. In other words, these people had to be killed for the greater good, for the furtherance of the state's utopian aims. It is important that we learn about these tragedies, not simply because of their academic interest, but because they remain and will always remain relevant. Unfortunately, the brutal North Korean government is still in power, perpetrating a genocide of mind-boggling magnitude against hundreds of thousands of innocents, all in the name of utopia. We should not ever be deceived into thinking that human institutions can produce a perfect society, and we should not give power to someone who promises anything of the kind. We should aim high and always seek to improve, but never forget the unmistakable lesson of history. An imperfect species cannot be molded into the cast of utopia.